These are your notes for forensic psychology and serial killers. Make sure you are following along and completing the document. A subfield of psychology, the application of clinical specialties to the legal arena. That's kind of what we're talking about with forensic psychology. The focus is on the psychological assessment of individuals who are involved in one way or another with the legal system. This may or may not be related to some sort of crime. Forensic psychologists need training in the law, forensic psychology, and solid clinical skills. They have to be able to conduct strong interviews, write strong reports that may be used in a court setting, and they have to have strong verbal communication skills. Some of the tasks they do are threat assessments for school, child custody evaluations, competency evaluations for defendants or the elderly. Competency evaluations are what is used to determine if someone can plead insanity in a case. They may also provide counseling services to any victims of crimes, and they may be involved in the delivery and evaluation of intervention or treatment programs for juvenile and adult offenders. So it's not just dealing directly with criminals and the court systems. It may also be kind of behind the scene things, working in prisons and things like that. We're going to spend some time talking about criminal profiling. This is a process that began informally in the late 1940s. It gives investigators clues and hints about how the perpetrator acts, possible motives they may have, and any age, gender, or background. So it kind of gives hints about who they may be looking for. In order to create a criminal profile, there are a couple of steps. So step number one is input. The forensic psychologist is going to collect as much information as they can from the crime scene. Number two is the decision process. They're going to arrange that input to find some sort of meaningful patterns about the victim and the offender, to see if they can discern any important things about the possible offender. Crime assessment, they're going to reconstruct the crime and the offender motivation, try to determine why the offender committed the crime in the way that they did. Number four is creating the criminal profile. They're going to develop specific descriptions of the offender, such as what race they are, what kind of background they come from, their age, their gender, all of those kinds of things to help investigators kind of track down who could have committed this crime. Number five is the investigation. They're going to use that profile as an aid in the investigation. Most of the time it's helpful, especially when they don't have any idea who the suspect may be. This can kind of help them narrow their search a little bit. But criminal profiling doesn't mean that that person is absolutely going to have those traits. And then six is apprehension. They're going to check the accuracy against any new information that emerges and then adjust the profile accordingly with whatever new information they gain. The person who's doing the profiling, so the forensic psychologist, they're going to assess all of the evidence, autopsy reports, and other forensic information, but they do not review the suspect list. If they look at the suspect list, that could influence their opinion. They're trying to look at it from an unbiased point of view to see if they can discern any particular patterns. There is something called victim risk that they're going to evaluate. So victim risk is the amount of risk a victim placed on him or herself to become a victim. So high-risk victims are people that place themselves in vulnerable situations, such as prostitution or selling drugs. Those are high-risk victims. They're already, because of their everyday lives, in vulnerable situations. Low-risk victims are going to be victims where their occupation and lifestyle would not normally increase their risk for becoming a victim. These are people who don't normally partake in any risky activities. They don't partake in any illegal activities. High-risk victims are things like runaways, hitchhikers, drug addicts, gang members. Low-risk victims are going to be kind of the average person who stays at home, who isn't involved with any of those kind of people, who isn't involved with any of those kinds of activities. Different perpetrators are going to seek out different types of victims. That's one clue profilers can use. They can also assess offender risk. The offender risk is the level of risk the offender placed on himself and that might lead to his apprehension. For example, a high-risk offender is someone who has a very high likelihood of getting caught. They don't take a lot of care in making sure that they cover up their tracks. Versus a low-risk offender is someone whose chances of apprehension are very minimal. For example, they commit their crimes at night with no obvious witnesses, or they commit their crimes out in a remote area. They make sure to clean up after themselves and cover their tracks. High-risk offenders and low-risk offenders are another thing that profilers look for when trying to determine the kind of suspect they're looking for. So some other psychological considerations. There's this idea of escalation. Most individuals who commit crimes begin with less serious offenses, and then over the years, their level of criminality increases. For example, they may start with voyeurism and then escalate to burglary, and then to assault, and then to rape, and then to murder. It's unusual for the first crime to be something serious like a murder. We're also going to consider what we call the modus operandi, or the MO. The MO is the method or technique of carrying out the crime. The offender's MO may change over time, but it is a pattern that we can look for that's going to give clues as to whether certain crimes are connected. So it's the method, the tools, the technique of carrying out the particular crime. So as an individual gains more experience, they often adapt their criminal technique to increase efficiency and prevent mistakes. That's why their MO is going to change over time. This cannot be used to link crimes. It's not specific enough. For example, the MO may be shooting individuals with a .44 pistol. There's a lot of people that use a .44 pistol. That's not enough to link crimes together, but it is a pattern that we would start to think about. For example, the technique for killing or disposing remains, the times and dates that the crimes are committed, the location of the offenses. That's not enough to say that all of these crimes were committed by the same person. We need something much more specific to be able to do that. Something that is a little bit more specific is a signature. A signature is a unique set of acts that an offender engages in with each victim. This is something that is very unique to the particular offender. So this is when we're talking about like serial offenders or potentially like serial killers. Many serial offenders engage in repetitive, ritualistic behavior at the crime scene. For example, they may position the body in a particular way. They may be involved in some sort of mutilation or symbolic gestures. Maybe they leave behind certain written statements. Those are all things that are a signature. They are the same at every single crime scene committed by that same offender. They're always the same for that one offender, and they can be used to link those crimes together. So if we see that the MO is the same and there's a signature that's the same, that would be enough information to link those crimes together and say, hey, these were all committed by the same offender. We know we're looking for one person who committed multiple crimes. Every crime is going to have an MO, but not all crimes have a signature. A signature is something that develops for these serial offenders, for these offenders who have committed the same types of crimes many times over. Other clues that we're going to look for at the crime scene when creating a profile is whether a crime scene is organized or disorganized. An organized crime scene is going to be much cleaner and much more thoughtful in terms of the offender. So the body is likely going to be hidden. The weapon is going to be removed. We're likely not going to find the weapon at the crime scene. The crime scene is going to appear very well planned. And it looks like if there was any sort of aggression, if there was any sort of confrontation with the victim, it happened before the victim died. Versus a disorganized crime scene, likely the body is not hidden. The weapon may be present at the crime scene. The crime scene may appear very spontaneous. And there may be some aggression post-mortem. So that means there may be some sort of mutilation or aggression on the body after the victim has already died. So here's an example of a disorganized crime scene. You can see that there's a lot of blood left around. It looks like there may be weapons left in certain places. The body is not really hidden. It's kind of out in the open. The furniture is all askew, right? It looks like the person didn't really take much care when they came in. And the person walked all over the place, right? So they entered the door, presumably killed this victim, went to go wash their hands. They're kind of all over the crime scene. Versus this is a much more organized crime scene. For example, the offender, comes in, kills the victim, either leaves the victim in the bed, maybe like covered with the sheets or blankets, or maybe has the victim underneath the bed. There's a little bit of blood found in the bathtub, but there's no trails showing exactly where the offender was. There's no weapons left behind, right? There's a lot fewer clues. This is characteristic of a crime that was much more planned and thought out. If a crime scene is organized, it suggests that the offender has an average or above average IQ. They're someone who is typically employed, usually some sort of skilled employment where they would need some sort of training or education. They're usually someone who is socially competent, who has social awareness, who has a normal social life. And a lot of times they're obsessed with media coverage of the crimes. They want to be in the media. They want their crimes to be in the media. They want to have people know that this crime was committed in the area. If it's a disorganized crime scene, this is going to suggest a below average IQ, likely unstable employment, someone who jumps from job to job, someone who is socially isolated, doesn't have a lot of friends, doesn't have a great social life, likely someone who lives very close to the scene because it is something that's very spontaneous, and usually someone who's very anxious once they commit that crime, right? They're panicky, right? They don't know what to do. They didn't necessarily think through all of the steps of committing that crime. So after the crime is committed, they're very anxious about what happens next. When we talk about murders, there is a tool that was developed called the Scale of Evil. The Scale of Evil has 22 levels of depravity that was developed by psychiatrists in 2005. The purpose of this tool is to help courts decide whether a convicted murderer should face execution, like death penalty, capital punishment, or if they should just face imprisonment. These scales of evil are in no way saying that one type of murder is less bad than another type of murder. It's just a tool for courts to use when determining the punishment for that murder. So the different factors that they considered when assessing evil, so to speak, is they looked at the prolonged duration of the victim's suffering. If the victim suffered for a longer period of time, that is considered more evil. If they inflicted an exceptional degree of physical harm, if they imposed suffering in order to cause panic, terror, or helplessness, that is considered more evil. And if the victim was a child, that is also going to be higher on the scale of evil. So this is the scale that we look at, the 22 different levels. So level 1 would be kind of self-defense type murders would be like level 1, for example. 2 through 8 are the impulsive murders where they're not really planned. They're kind of heat of the moment sort of murders. Semi-psychopaths they maybe had some sort of plan or some sort of scheme, but it's kind of a one-time action. These are semi-psychopathic individuals. And then 16 through 22, these are what we call serial killers. These are typically people who have multiple offenses, multiple murderers, have very strong psychopathic traits. And where those serial killers fall all depends on those other factors, such as who their victim is, if they inflict any sort of torture on their victim, things like that. All right, so here are different types of murders. These are terms that you will hear come up. Self-defense. Self-defense murders are people that are killed as their only way to escape from some sort of life-threatening situation. They maybe didn't intend to murder the person. They did it as a way to save their own life. A heat of passion murder is someone who's accused of killing someone, but they claim that they didn't plan to kill them, right? It's some sort of argument that happened that kind of pushed them over the edge. In the heat of that moment, they killed the person. When we talk about psychopathic traits, we're talking about individuals that have very shallow emotional responses. They have impaired feelings of remorse and empathy, so they don't really think that what they did is wrong. They can't really understand other people's point of view. And they often present as very egotistical or very disinhibited. These are people who think very highly of themselves, who have very little impulse control. Sociopathic traits are people that we think of with antisocial personality disorder. So they have a very difficult time in social situations. They're very antisocial. They have blatant disregard for laws and safety and rights of others. They think that the laws don't apply to them. They don't understand why the laws are there. They may have a weak or non-existent conscience, so they don't have that voice in their head that tells them they're doing something wrong. And they're very impulsive. An important note, psychopathic and sociopathic traits do not make a murderer. Rather, they describe traits that many types of murderers may possess. People can have psychopathic traits or sociopathic traits without ever murdering, right? These are just personality traits that we can use to describe different types of murderers. So when we're talking about multiple murderers, so people that have killed multiple people, there are a couple of different types. There are mass murderers. These are people that kill 4 or more people at one location during one continuous period of time. So an example would be Timothy McVeigh. He was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombings, killed many people, one location, one period of time, one specific day. That's different than a spree killer. Spree killers are also called rampage killers. They kill 2 or more victims, but at more than one location with no cooling off period. So these are killers, for example, the Beltway sniper, who was responsible for the DC sniper attacks, killed multiple victims, all in the Washington, D.C. area, different locations, but there wasn't a cooling off period in between. He didn't go days or weeks between victims. They were all very, very quickly, very close together. And that's different than a serial killer. A serial killer is categorized as someone who has killed 3 or more people at 3 or more locations in 3 or more separate events with some sort of cooling off period in between. So these are the types of murderers like Jeffrey Dahmer, who committed the murders over years, sometimes decades, killed more than 3 people, often at different locations, in different events. So there was a cooling off period between them. The cooling off period may be a week, it may be a month, it may be years in some cases. But that cooling off period, where they kill someone, have a cooling off period, and then murder again, that's characteristic of a serial killer. So here's the general profile for a serial killer. Most serial killers that we look at will fall into have these different traits. They are typically very intelligent. They typically have a high IQ, typically ranging from 54 to 186, which is a very large range. I understand that, but the kind of average IQ is 94.7. The number of victims, interestingly, of a serial killer is linked to their IQ. The higher the IQ, the more victims they tend to have. For example, someone who only kills 2 people has a lower IQ than one who has 5 or more than 5. The more victims, the higher the IQ tends to be. They have an average age of 27.5 when they begin killing. They're typically male. They tend to have some superficial charm. That's part of a psychopathic trait. So they may seem like a very social person, very normal, personable, charming. Often they have a history of abuse or some sort of trauma in their childhood. History of petty crimes. This is that idea of escalation. Very rarely is murder their first crime. They often have other minor crimes leading up to that. And many of them also show what we call the McDonald triad, which is bedwetting after the age of 12, arson or fire setting, purposeful fire setting, and killing of small animals. So many of them have those 3 traits as well. There are a couple different motivations for serial killers. One of the motivations is what we call visionary. So these are individuals who suffer some sort of psychotic break that leads them to believe that they are someone else and are compelled by a higher power, whether it be the devil or be God, to carry out these particular crimes. David Berkowitz is an example of this. He believed that there was a demon in his neighbor's dog that told him to kill all these people. He had a complete psychotic break. And that's what led him to becoming a serial killer. Some serial killers are mission-oriented. They believe that they are ridding the world of a certain type of person. For example, they may target drug users or target prostitutes or target ex-cons. They believe that they are doing the world a favor by getting rid of those people. An example would be Joseph Paul Franklin. He killed Jewish, biracial, and African Americans in order to incite a race war. He was purely driven by the idea of ridding the world of particular races. Some serial killers are hedonistic. That means they get some sort of pleasure from killing or torture or sexual assault. The Zodiac killer is an example of a hedonistic killer. He stated in one of his notes that killing gives me the most thrilling experience. So he was driven from that pleasure of killing and torturing individuals. Some serial killers are motivated by power or control. They want to exert power over their victim. An example of that would be Ted Bundy. He exerted power and control over his female victims. That's what drove him to find additional female victims, as he liked being in control. He liked having that sense of power. And others are motivated by media influence. So they want fame or to be renowned for their actions. They enjoy causing fear and panic in the area. An example would be Dennis Rader, who otherwise known as BTK. He sought out attention from the press. He talked to the press. He was near the crime scenes. He wanted to be known. He wanted his actions to be in the media. And that is the end of our notes for forensic psychology. Please make sure that you have filled out all of the blanks and turn them in on Canvas.